He'd always measured his days by weather and work. How the frost held to the grass in spring mornings, how the soil broke under the plough after the first thaw, how his body ached in the evenings when the chores were done. Ethan Ward had learned to read the world in those signs. Farming was a promise. You showed up, you worked, you endured. That was enough. After the war, with all its noise and orders and pointless chaos, the rhythm of planting and harvest had been the only thing that steadied him. A man alone in his fields at dawn was a man who could still breathe. But the air inside Mr. Harlan's office in St. John's was heavy, nothing like the clean bite of salt wind or the honest smell of earth. It smelled of lemon polish, stale tobacco, and money so old it no longer remembered whose hands had held it. The furniture was dark wood, stiff and unwelcoming, the walls lined with shelves of books that looked more ornamental than read. Ethan sat there in his work boots, jeans, and a plaid shirt patched at one elbow, feeling like a misplaced tool in a parlor. His posture was straight. Years of discipline never left you, but his jaw was tight. Across the polished desk sat his cousin, Victor Ward, dressed in an expensive suit that looked as if it had been poured over him. Victor's dark hair gleamed with product, his round face held an expression of smug certainty, and his fingers drummed a restless beat on the arm of the leather chair. He was the kind of man who had never patched a fence in his life, and never would. Mr. Harland, the lawyer, cleared his throat. His face was a parchment of old lines, his voice a dry rustle. We come now to the final bequests of the late Mr. Samuel Ward. The name stirred something old in Ethan, a flash of memory, a rough hand steadying him on a dock, the smell of diesel and salt, a gruff voice telling him to watch the horizon. But that was decades ago. He and his grandfather had been estranged, the old man bitter at Ethan's choice to enlist, Ethan too stubborn to explain. Harland read through the will, parceling out stocks and properties. Almost everything went to Victor: city holdings, company shares, the Ward family shipping office. With each bequest, Victor's smirk deepened. Finally, Harland paused, peering over his glasses at Ethan. To my grandson Ethan Ward, I leave my home upon the rock known as Greywatch Ledge, off the coast of Newfoundland, and everything upon it. I entrust to his care my companion Scout. This bequest is made with a specific understanding. Greywatch Ledge is given to Ethan because he alone understands the value of a silent watch. Ethan felt the words strike deeper than the room's heavy air. A silent watch. It was what farmers did at dawn, what soldiers did at midnight, what lonely men did when they had no one left but the land and the sea. For a moment, it felt like Samuel Ward was speaking directly to him across the years. Victor let out a sharp laugh. A worthless rock and a dog. The old man really lost it. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Unless, of course, he buried treasure there. Better start digging, cousin. That's all you're getting. Ethan didn't answer. The insult meant nothing. The fortune didn't matter. Only those 6 words mattered, resonating like a tolling bell. A silent watch. When Victor swaggered out, leaving a waft of cologne behind, Harlan leaned forward. Your cousin misunderstands. Samuel was deliberate. He set aside a modest trust for supplies and upkeep, enough to keep a man alive out there. He also arranged care for the dog until you arrived. Harlan slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a deed, a map, and the name of a fisherman, Caleb Doyle, who would ferry him out. Ethan touched the paper, feeling the weight of his inheritance. Not wealth, but isolation. Not comfort, but purpose. 2 days later, Ethan stood on a weathered pier in a small Newfoundland harbour, the Atlantic stretching endless and cold. Caleb Doyle was there, mending a net beneath a yellow bulb. The fisherman was wiry and sun-lined, his hands moving with the ease of long practice. Ward boy, he said without ceremony. Samuel's kin. I'll take you out. Tied at the dock was a scarred workboat, low in the water, its paint faded but its lines steady. Sitting in the stern, as still as a carved figurehead, was a dog. Ethan's breath caught. Scout was magnificent, a German shepherd with a coat of grey and white like sea foam in moonlight. His amber eyes fixed on Ethan, sharp and unblinking, no bark, no wag, just watchfulness. Ethan approached slowly. Scout, he said softly. The dog tilted his head, sniffed the air, then stepped forward. A moment later, his nose touched Ethan's palm, a spark of trust passing between them. The tail gave one slow thump. It was enough. The boat ride out was rough, the sea restless under a grey sky. Scout stood at the bow like he belonged there, ears forward, body braced. After half an hour, Grey Watch Ledge appeared, a jagged tooth of granite rising from the sea, crowned by a leaning wooden house that looked ready to be claimed by the next storm. Victor's mocking words echoed, "Worthless rock." But to Ethan, it looked like the edge of the world, stripped of everything but truth. The landing was a crude stone shelf. Scout leapt ashore with ease. Ethan followed, his boots slipping on wet rock. Together they climbed to the house. Up close it was worse, salt-bleached wood, sagging porch, a shutter hanging by one hinge. Inside, it smelled of damp and sea. Empty, but not lifeless. Ethan dropped his bag on the floor. Scout pressed against his leg, steady, grounding. "All right," Ethan murmured. "We'll make it livable." The days settled into rhythm. Ethan repaired the porch with scavenged boards, scraped salt crust from the windows, patched the roof with tar and canvas. Farming had taught him patience. He knew how to mend with his hands. Each repair was a battle won against time and weather. Scout was always near, silent company. On stormy nights, they sat by the hearth, the fire crackling. Ethan found a chest of leather-bound journals left by Samuel. They were meticulous logs, tide patterns, seabird migrations, the hum of waves against granite. But Samuel wrote not just as a fisherman, he wrote like an engineer listening to the earth. He called them the songs of the ocean. Ethan felt a strange awe reading them, as if he were glimpsing the mind of a man he'd never truly known. Then one rain-heavy night Scout stirred. He rose from the rug, padded to the hearth, and began sniffing the wide stone base. He whined, scratched once, then again, claws rasping against granite. Ethan frowned. "Nothing there, boy." But Scout's amber eyes were insistent. Ethan remembered the dogs in Afghanistan, how one sudden halt had saved his unit from a buried mine. A good dog knew. You listened. Ethan fetched a crowbar, worked it into the faint seam he finally felt. With a groan, the stone shifted. Beneath was a hollow lined with dull grey lead. Inside lay a bundle of oilcloth and a heavy brass object. Ethan unwrapped the cloth, another journal. He lifted the brass piece. It was machined with grooves and notches, like a key meant for no ordinary lock. The journal began not with diagrams or coordinates, but with a confession written in Samuel's steady, meticulous hand. "My name is Samuel Ward. I was an acoustic engineer with the Navy. Grey Watch Ledge is no mere rock. It is a lens, a natural amplifier of the ocean's voice." The words seemed to pulse on the page, as if carrying the weight of all the nights Samuel had sat alone, pen scratching under lantern light, knowing no one else might ever read what he wrote. He described how he had discovered the truth almost by accident, hearing resonances no instrument should have been able to detect. The rock itself gathered sound, magnified it, focused it like a great ear pressed to the sea. Samuel had written of long days spent hollowing out chambers, chiseling with hand and machine, until the granite gave way to carefully designed vaults. He spoke of installing tidal turbines in hidden shafts, machines that drank the endless motion of the ocean and transformed it into steady power. He spoke of building a secret station, its veins running with energy pulled not from coal or fire, but from the moon's patient pull. Yet Samuel's words were not those of a man drunk on invention or ambition. They were words weighted with conscience. "I wanted to listen," he admitted, "not to weaponize. I wanted to hear the ocean's true voice, to reveal what had always been hidden. But I knew others would see only profit, only control, only power." On the final pages, written in a hand that trembled slightly with age, were words Ethan would never forget. "Use it to protect, not to profit." Ethan stared at the brass key lying on the table, its surface catching the firelight with a soft gleam that seemed alive. It was heavier than it looked, dense with meaning, every ridge and curve smoothed by Samuel's touch over years of use. Turning it over in his hand, Ethan felt not just metal, but memory. His grandfather's presence pressed into the grooves, the weight of decisions made long before he was born. He realized then that his inheritance was not the cabin, not the rock, not even the solitude the sea had wrapped around him. It was something far greater and far more dangerous. This was not a gift to be enjoyed. It was a charge to be carried, a secret greater than any measure of land or coin, a responsibility that could not be shrugged away or buried beneath the waves. He kept the key close, often setting it on the table beside him at night. the fire casting long shadows that stretched across the journal's open pages. Its gleam seemed to accuse him if he turned away, to remind him that knowledge demanded action. For days, he immersed himself in the cipher. Samuel had left, scrawled in the back of the journal, lines of strange marks and symbols threaded through tide tables and lunar charts. At first, the patterns seemed impenetrable, like a foreign language written in the rhythms of the moon and the sea. But slowly, as he studied by lamplight, the logic revealed itself. Coordinates appeared hidden in the clutter, constellations tied to phases of the moon, cryptic instructions disguised as riddles only an engineer, or a man patient enough to learn, could decipher. Ethan traced each figure carefully, running his fingertip along the faded ink, whispering the numbers under his breath as though saying them aloud would draw them into alignment. He kept notes of his own in the margins, layering his handwriting beside Samuel's, as if the two men were collaborating across time. The work demanded more of him than any soldiering had. Not strength, but endurance of a different kind. The patience to sit with silence, to think in cycles rather than seconds. Scout would lie at his feet, head resting on Ethan's boot, the occasional soft sigh rising into the stillness, as if the dog, too, understood the gravity of the search. At night, by lantern glow, the pages seemed to change under his gaze. The flickering light gave life to the lines, so that the cipher almost moved, like currents shifting beneath the surface. Sometimes Ethan felt a presence in those moments, as if Samuel himself stood just behind him, watching, guiding, whispering what to seek. It was not haunting, but a kind of steadying, a reminder that this task was not begun in loneliness, even if it had to be completed in it. By day, he walked the cliffs, journal folded under his arm, eyes searching the restless expanse of the sea. The salt wind bit his face, the gulls cried overhead, and the rhythm of waves against stone seemed to chant some answer just beyond his hearing. He stopped often, crouching to study the patterns of foam where the tide struck the rocks, testing Samuel's numbers against the living sea. He measured shadows at dawn, watched how the water climbed and retreated along the same scarred ledges, and wondered how much of this knowledge had been gathered by his grandfather, through trial and error, through decades of listening. Hour after hour, Ethan traced the hidden logic, cross-referencing tide tables with the night sky. He charted the shifting of the moon, drew lines against maps both old and new, and each time he felt closer, as though he were not solving a puzzle but remembering something his blood already knew. And always, beside him, Scout watched the horizon, as if waiting for the sea to finally give up its secret. Ethan carried on, patient, tireless, searching for signs of what the numbers promised. The cipher pointed, at last, to a formation Samuel had called the Trident. It was visible only at spring tide, when the sea retreated farther than usual, baring the bones of the ocean floor. Ethan waited, watched the moon climb and dip, until the night came, when the tide would pull back its furthest. When morning broke, the sea was already withdrawing. Ethan and Scout set out across the wet stone, boots slipping on kelp that clung to the ledges like green ribbons. The air smelled sharp, briny, filled with the cries of gulls wheeling overhead. The rocks were slick, jagged, and the tide's absence revealed strange shapes, pools filled with darting shrimp, channels cut deep into the basalt, the hidden architecture of the sea exposed like ribs. Then Scout stopped. His ears pricked, his body went still, and his nose pointed toward a curtain of seaweed draped thickly over a sheer wall of rock. The dog let out a single bark, not frantic, not questioning, but sharp and sure. A declaration, a confirmation. Ethan's heart quickened. He pushed forward, the seaweed cold and slimy against his hands, and brushed it aside. Beneath the veil of green lay not raw stone, but a shape too perfect to be natural, a circular indentation, precise and deliberate, cut into the granite itself. His breath caught in his chest. The brass key trembled in his fingers as he lifted it, its weight suddenly monumental. He slid it into the indentation, and it fit as though it had been waiting, as though the stone itself had been holding its breath for this moment. Ethan turned the key. The granite vibrated, a deep rumble shivering through his bones. The indentation expanded into a line, sharp and clean, stretching outward in both directions. Dust fell in tiny streams, the ground beneath his feet humming. Slowly, impossibly, the section of cliff shifted inward. The rock did not shatter or crumble. It moved as if engineered, sliding away with the silent precision of a vault door. Beyond lay a tunnel. Black, cool, and impossibly straight, it breathed out a gust of stale, untouched air. The smell was of stone and iron, of secrets sealed away for decades. Scout did not hesitate. The dog padded inside, paws soundless on the stone, tail held high as though he knew this path had been made for him. Ethan swallowed, tightened his grip on the lantern, and followed. 50 feet in, the narrow passage curved sharply, the damp stone walls glistening with condensation from centuries of salt and tide. The air grew cooler, heavier, each step echoing faintly as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Then the tunnel widened, and there it was. A steel door, heavy as a vault, its surface mottled with age but unyielding. In the center, a great wheel of iron waited. Ethan placed both hands on it. The metal was cold, biting into his skin, but familiar somehow, as if the shape of it had been etched into his memory by the words of Samuel's journal. He braced, turned, and the wheel shifted with a long groan. Pressure hissed, a sudden breath released after decades sealed away. Slowly, reluctantly, the door swung open. Beyond was not darkness, but a chamber vast enough to swallow the old shack above 10 times over. A cavern carved into living stone, every surface shaped with purpose. Banks of consoles lined the walls, their faces blank, dust dulling their edges. Servers towered like ancient sentinels, cables running like roots into the rock. And before it all, dominating the chamber, stood a massive curved screen, silent and black, waiting like a closed eye. The air was dry, tinged with the faint copper scent of long-idled machinery. A low vibration hummed beneath the floor, so subtle that Ethan wondered if it was his imagination, the heartbeat of something not quite dead, only sleeping. He stepped forward, boots crunching faintly on grit, Scout padding close by with ears raised, as though he too sensed the weight of what they had uncovered. Then his eyes fell to the plaque mounted just beneath the screen, its edges worn but the words clear, engraved with deliberate care by Samuel's hand. Use it to protect, not to profit. The watch is now yours. Ethan stood silent. The hum of the chamber wrapped around him like a mantle, and for the first time since the war, he felt not adrift but anchored. Not lost but placed. As if every road, every wound, every lonely mile had been a thread leading here. As if his life had been a long march leading here. But Victor was not done. Weeks later, when the sea had lulled itself into a rhythm of calm grey mornings and slow rolling tides, a new threat arrived. Out of the mist came a sleek yacht, its hull white and gleaming, the polished chrome catching what little light filtered through the clouds. It looked out of place against the harsh cliffs and the restless water, a predator disguised as luxury. On its deck stood Victor, dressed as though for a gala rather than the jagged rocks of this lonely outpost. Beside him were 2 men he had brought for muscle, Finn, wiry and twitching with nervous energy, eyes darting like a trapped rat, and Rook, a broad-shouldered brute whose silence was more menacing than any words. Their presence was not accidental. It was a performance, a show of force, meant to unsettle. They disembarked with practiced arrogance, a small skiff ferrying them through the chop until they reached the rocks. Climbing the ledges slick with salt spray, they wore smirks as if they already owned the place. Their polished shoes slipped against the stone, but they pressed on, demanding entry as though Ethan were a tenant and they the landlords come to collect. Victor's voice carried easily over the wind, sharp as a blade. He accused Ethan of theft, of hiding technology forged with family money, of clinging to secrets that rightfully belonged to him. He waved a hand toward the shack as though it were no more than a locked vault waiting to be opened. His tone left no room for negotiation. It was his intention, he said, to sell everything to investors across the sea, powerful men who knew the worth of hidden weapons and who would pay dearly for them. Ethan said nothing at first. He stood in the doorway with Scout at his side, the dog's hackles raised, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Ethan had read enough in his grandfather's journals to know that some inheritances were too dangerous to be sold, too costly to fall into the wrong hands. Victor's greed was naked now, stripped of all pretense. Then the weather turned. A storm rose with terrifying speed, the kind sailors told of in old taverns, sudden and merciless. The horizon darkened to slate, the wind screamed like a living thing, and waves hammered the ledge with fists of foam and spray. The shack shook beneath the assault, wooden beams groaning as if the very bones of the place were crying out. Scout lifted his head and howled, a long, mournful sound that cut through the roar of the storm. Ethan froze. He had heard that sound described before, written in Samuel's cramped handwriting in the old leather journal. It was not the howl of fear, nor of rage, but of warning. A signal that even the granite itself, the ancient bones of the island, was under strain. The house would not last. Victor and his men laughed at first, dismissing the howl as theatrics. But then a thunderclap struck so close the air itself seemed to split, and a wave smashed against the wall with such force the windows bowed inward. The shack shuddered, splinters flying from its joints, the chimney cracking down its spine. Ethan acted without hesitation. He pulled open the hearth slab, the stone groaning as it swung aside to reveal the passage his grandfather had hidden for precisely this moment. "This way," he ordered, voice hard enough to cut through both wind and doubt. For one stunned heartbeat, no one moved. Then the roof beams began to snap, and the decision was made for them. They scrambled down, the storm clawing at their backs, just as the shack tore itself apart. The roof peeled away like paper, the walls collapsed in a roar of splintering wood, and the sea claimed what had once been home. Inside the station, deep beneath the rock, the air was cooler, the walls vibrating faintly with the storm above. The screen flickered to life, showing streams of data struggling to hold steady as the acoustic noise of the gale battered every instrument. Waves crashing overhead masked much of the world beyond, but beneath the distortion a pattern emerged, chaotic at first, then unmistakable. A submarine signature, moving fast, closing in. Victor's investors. The thought landed like a blow. They were already here, using the storm as cover, their steel hull hidden beneath layers of white noise and ocean fury. This was no accident. It was a coordinated strike. Ethan's hands moved quickly across the controls, fingers recalling what he had studied night after night in his grandfather's notes. He composed the signal, encoded it with the same care a farmer sows seed into soil, and pressed the key. A burst of light-speed message shot outward, hostile submersible approaching, Vulture's nest compromised. Then the station went quiet again, except for the howl of the wind through hidden vents and the relentless pounding of the sea above. Ethan looked at Victor, at Finn, at Rook. They were pale in the flickering light, their earlier arrogance bleeding away. Scout pressed close to Ethan's leg, eyes unblinking, muscles taut. There was nowhere to run now, no way out, but through. Ethan inhaled, steadying himself, and he waited, trapped between storm and enemy. Hours passed. The storm eased, though the sea still rolled like a living thing, restless even as the rain thinned to mist. Ethan and Scout stood together at the edge of the rock, watching the dark shape of the submarine circle closer, its movements patient and predatory. The air carried the taste of salt and iron, and every distant crash of the waves sounded like the echo of some ancient heartbeat beneath the ocean. Then, just before dawn's first blush touched the horizon, two golden signatures cut through the fog. Fast, sharp, deliberate. Coast Guard cutters. They came like hounds released from the leash, flanking the submarine with practiced precision. Spotlights stabbed the gloom, horns bellowed commands over the water. The cutters bracketed the sub, forcing it to break surface, steel groaning as it rose reluctantly into the pale light. By morning, the sea lay calmer, though tension clung like smoke. Armed sailors poured across the waves in rigid formation, boarding the submarine with shouted orders and weapons ready. Victor and his men were pulled out one by one, their confidence stripped away with their weapons. Their hands were bound, their eyes darting like wolves suddenly caught in a snare. They cursed, but the sea swallowed their words. Another vessel arrived soon after. From it stepped Admiral Ross, his tall frame unmistakable, silver hair gleaming like frost beneath the grey sky. His eyes, steady and unyielding, searched the horizon before settling on Ethan. There was no need for ceremony, the weight of history already hung between them. He approached slowly, the storm-washed deck creaking beneath his boots. For a long moment he simply looked at Ethan, and Ethan felt the same way he had when his grandfather's voice used to fill the old shack with quiet certainty. That sense of being measured not for strength of arm, but for strength of heart. Finally, Ross spoke. His words carried not command, but reverence. Your grandfather built something extraordinary. It cannot be abandoned. He trusted you. Will you take the watch? The question was not just about machines or signals. It was about legacy. About standing where another had stood, carrying the silence, the vigilance, the unseen weight of guarding more than himself. Ethan turned. He looked at Scout first, the dog's amber eyes unflinching, steady in their loyalty. He looked at the endless horizon, the breathing ocean stretching farther than any man could walk. He looked at the jagged rock beneath his boots, the rock that had become more than shelter. It had become home, a place where the past spoke in whispers and the future waited in silence. "Yes, sir," Ethan said at last. His voice was steady, stronger than he expected. Months later, the rock bore a new crown. Where the weather-beaten shack had once stood, a reinforced observation post rose against the wind and salt, its steel bones anchored deep into stone. It hummed with quiet power, antennae stretching skyward, glass windows catching the sun like watchful eyes. Ethan tended the post as he had once tended fields, steady, patient, with hands that understood both soil and signal. He checked dials, mended circuits, wrote in logbooks with the same discipline his grandfather had used to sharpen tools. There was no applause, no crowd, only the ocean's eternal applause in the crash of its waves. Scout never left his side. The dog would sit beside him on the cliff, ears pricked, gaze fixed on the horizon, as though he, too, carried part of the watch. Sometimes, when the night fell heavy and the stars wheeled slowly above, Ethan thought Scout heard things he could not, distant engines, whispers of storms beyond the curve of the world. And Ethan trusted him. The days blended into seasons. Gulls wheeled overhead, storms came and went, and the sea never tired of reminding them of its vastness. Yet the post stood. Ethan stood. And in the rhythm of solitude he found something he had not expected. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of belonging. He had thought inheritance meant land, coin, or papers hidden in safes. But standing on that rock, listening to the ocean, he understood what his grandfather had truly left him. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is not gold or land, but purpose. And sometimes it takes the loyalty of a dog to remind a man that even in solitude, he is never alone.